She gave away the last food in her house to a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in 3 days. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from. She didn't know that feeding him that one bowl of soup would change the entire course of her life. And she definitely didn't know that 6 months later, a woman draped in furs and gold, with silver hair and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, would knock on her door and say 4 words that would make her knees buckle. My son remembers you. If you're new here, like the video, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop in the comments where you're watching from. We have people watching from all over the world, and I want to see your city. Now let's get into this story, because it is about to wreck you completely. Her name was Emerie Voss. And the first thing you needed to know about Emerie was this: she had nothing. Not in a dramatic, poetic way. In a real, concrete, painful way. She had a one-room cabin at the edge of Coldvale Forest. A cabin her grandmother had left her, which was the only reason she had a roof at all. The wood was rotting at the base. The chimney leaked smoke back into the room when the wind blew a certain direction. One of the windows had been covered with plastic sheeting since last winter. She had a job, or she used to. She had worked at the general supply store in town for 4 years, stacking shelves and managing inventory, and she had been good at it. Quiet, precise, never late. But the owner had sold the shop to a man named Harwick Drell, and Harwick Drell had a nephew who needed work, and that was the end of Emerie's employment. No severance. No apology. Just a thin envelope with 2 weeks' pay and a look that said she should be grateful even for that. She had been job hunting for 6 weeks when the stranger appeared. It was deep into autumn. The kind of October night where the cold doesn't just sit on your skin, it gets inside your bones and makes itself comfortable. Emerie had walked home from the town center after another failed attempt at the bakery, the hardware store, and the feed supplier on the outskirts. All rejections. All polite. All final. She was tired. Not just physically. Emotionally tired. The kind of tired that settles in when you've been holding yourself together for so long that the holding becomes its own form of exhaustion. She was about 3 minutes from her cabin, walking along the dirt path that cut through the edge of the forest, when she heard it. A sound. Not a dramatic one. Not a growl, or a crash, or a howl. Just a breath. A heavy, labored, wet breath. Like something big trying very hard not to make noise. Emerie stopped walking. She was not a reckless woman. She was not the type to investigate strange sounds in forests at night. She had grown up on the edge of Coldvale, and she knew better than most that the forest was not empty. Strange things lived in it. Strange things moved through it. The town of Coldvale sat on the boundary of what old maps called the Hollow Reach, a deep stretch of ancient woodland that no road cut through and no development had ever touched. The locals had stories. Old ones. The kind passed down in low voices over dinner tables. Stories about lights in the trees and disappearances and creatures that walked upright, but were not men. Emerie had always taken those stories seriously, so she should have kept walking. But the breathing shifted, and through it, underneath it, she heard something else. A whimper. Low. Almost silent. The kind of sound a creature makes when it is trying to suppress pain and failing just barely. She turned toward it. The man was at the base of a large oak tree, maybe 15 feet off the path, half hidden by the undergrowth. He was sitting with his back against the trunk, one leg stretched out, one knee drawn up, and his head hanging forward. His clothes were destroyed, a dark shirt torn in long diagonal strips, trousers muddied and shredded at the knees. He was barefoot. Even in the dim light filtering through the canopy, she could see that he was bleeding. His left side, just below his ribs, dark and wet, staining what remained of his shirt. Hey. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Hey, can you hear me? He lifted his head slowly. And that was the first time she saw his face. She would spend a long time afterward trying to describe it, and she never quite got it right. He was, striking was the word she kept coming back to, but it wasn't strong enough. There was something almost architectural about his features. A jaw that looked carved. Eyes that were dark and deep-set, And even in that moment, even bleeding and broken against a tree, completely, startlingly alert, he looked at her, and she had the sudden, unnerving feeling that he was assessing her. Not the way a hurt person looks at a potential rescuer. The way a soldier looks at a new variable in an equation they're solving. I don't need help. His voice was rough, low, like gravel at the bottom of a river. Emerie blinked. You're bleeding. I know. Pretty badly. I know that too. She stood there for a moment, holding her bag, looking at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them moved. Then she said, "Can you walk?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible. "I can manage." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer this time. "Not well?" he admitted, and it sounded like it cost him something to say it. Like those two words were pulled from somewhere deep and resistant. She made a decision. She made it quickly, the way she made most decisions, not by overthinking, but by listening to the part of herself that had never once led her wrong. "My cabin's close." Come on. Getting him there was harder than she expected. He was heavy, not just in weight. Though he was large, much larger than she'd initially registered, a full head taller than her, and built in a way that suggested a life of serious physical labor or something more, but heavy in the way he moved. Every step deliberate. Every moment of leaning on her shoulder clearly costing him something he was not accustomed to paying. He didn't speak during the walk. Neither did she. When she got him inside and onto the wooden chair near the fire, she saw the wound properly for the first time. She was not a nurse. She had no medical training. But she had grown up on the edge of a forest, and she had dealt with enough hunting accidents and animal encounters to know the basics of wound care. The gash was deep, long. It ran from just below his left ribs to his hip, and it had the strange, ragged quality of something made by claws, not a blade. She didn't ask about it. She cleaned it with what she had: antiseptic solution she kept for emergencies, clean rags, and a needle and thread she had used for clothes mending. He sat completely still through the entire process. Not the stillness of someone who had passed out or gone into shock. The active, deliberate stillness of someone choosing not to react. At one point, she pressed too hard on the deepest part of the wound, and his hand shot out and gripped the edge of the chair so hard she heard the wood creak. But he didn't make a sound. When it was done, she washed her hands, put a pot on the fire, and opened her last can of broth. She had potatoes, 3 small ones, and the heel of a bread loaf and a handful of dried herbs from the bunch hanging by the window. She made soup. It wasn't much. It wasn't a proper meal. But it was hot, and it was everything she had. She set it in front of him without ceremony. He looked at the bowl for a long moment. "You don't have to. Eat," she said simply. "You need it." He ate. And something happened while he ate that she couldn't quite name. The rigid set of his shoulders loosened, just slightly. The tightness around his eyes eased. He didn't look soft. She had a feeling he never looked soft, but he looked, briefly, like someone who had set down a very heavy thing. When the bowl was empty, he looked up at her. "You gave me your last food." It wasn't a question. She met his gaze. "How do you know it's my last?" "The pantry behind you. The way you measured the broth. The way you counted the potatoes." His eyes moved to the plastic-covered window, the rotting baseboard, the single candle she'd lit to save the lamp oil. "You're struggling. So are you," she pointed out. Something flickered across his face. An expression she couldn't read. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emerie." She paused. "Yours?" The silence stretched just a breath too long. "Cormac," he said. Just that. Nothing else. She didn't push. She got a blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed, her second blanket, the thinner one, and offered it to him. "You can sleep in the chair. It's not comfortable, but it's warm." He looked at the blanket. Looked at her. "You don't know me." "No. I could be dangerous." "Could be," she agreed. "Are you?" That long pause again. That look she couldn't decode. "Not to you," he said quietly. She nodded, like that settled it, and went to bed. In the morning, he was gone. The chair was empty. The blanket was folded with near military precision and placed on the seat. The bowl she'd given him was washed and set back on the shelf. And on the small table by the door, there was a smooth, dark stone. Round, about the size of her thumb, warm to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She picked it up and turned it over. On one side, carved so finely it looked almost grown into the stone rather than cut into it, was a mark. Circular, like a sun, but with the rays curling inward instead of out. Like a spiral that had decided to become a symbol instead. She had no idea what it meant. She put it in her coat pocket and tried to forget about him. She couldn't. Life went on the way it does when you're surviving and not yet living. She found work eventually. 2 jobs, both part-time and underpaid. Mornings at the laundry service on the east side of town, evenings helping the aging Miller couple manage their supply inventory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to eat properly again. Enough to buy a decent pair of winter boots and get someone to look at the chimney. She thought about the man, Cormac, more than she should have. Not in a romantic way. At least, that's what she told herself. She thought about him the way you think about a strange dream that leaves residue in your waking hours. His voice, the way he'd looked at her, that assessing, penetrating look that had nothing frightened in it. The deliberate stillness when she stitched his wound. The way he'd said not to you, like it was a fact and not a reassurance. The stone stayed in her coat pocket. She touched it sometimes without thinking about it. Winter came. Cold veil under snow was almost beautiful enough to make you forget how brutal it was. The forest went white and silent. The town pulled inward, people spending less time outdoors, the market days growing shorter, the nights coming early and staying long. It was on one of those long winter nights, nearly 2 months after Cormac had appeared at her door and vanished before morning, that Emerie first noticed she was being watched. It wasn't dramatic, just a feeling. The particular feeling of eyes on the back of your neck in a place where there should be no eyes. She was walking home from the Miller's place, later than usual. They'd had a billing dispute that needed untangling, and the town was quiet and dim around her. She passed the fountain at the center square, the stone benches buried in snow. She turned down the lane that led toward the forest path, and she felt it. She stopped walking and turned around slowly. The lane was empty. She waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. She kept walking. But she walked faster. It happened again the next night. And the night after that. Never anything visible. Never anything that could be called evidence. Just that feeling, so persistent and specific that she could not write it off as nerves. Someone was watching her. Something was watching her. And it wasn't hostile. It didn't feel hostile, which was almost stranger. It felt attentive, protective, even. She started sleeping better than she had in years, which made no sense at all. The first real change came on a Friday in early December. Emerie arrived at the laundry service in the morning to find a month's back wages slipped under the door in a sealed envelope. A wage dispute she'd given up on ever recovering. No explanation. Just the money. In full, plus a small additional amount she hadn't expected. The owner, Mrs. Farrant, was as confused as she was. The second change came a week later. Harwick Drell, the man who'd taken her old job, came into the laundry with his washing and left looking shaken. That evening, word went around town that the regional inspector had shown up at his supply store and found a series of inventory discrepancies that were going to cost him considerably. The kind of discrepancies that looked, from certain angles, like they'd been reported by someone who knew exactly where to look. Emerie didn't connect any of this to Cormac. Not then. The third thing happened just before the winter solstice. She was at the market on a cold Saturday morning when a woman walked in who did not belong. Not in a suspicious way. Not in a threatening way. Just, she was too much for the space. Like putting a lit torch in a room full of candles. Every eye in the market turned toward her without the people attached to those eyes seeming to understand why. She was older, perhaps 60, perhaps ageless in a way that made the number meaningless. Silver-haired, Not in the way of aging, but in the way of something deliberate and inherent, like it had always been that color. She wore a long fur-lined coat, dark red, and she moved with the kind of unhurried authority that comes from decades of having rooms go quiet when you enter them. Her eyes were the color of winter bark, and they were sweeping the market with calm precision. They landed on Emerie, and they stayed. The woman crossed the market floor without looking away, and Emerie stood completely still, a paper bag of flour in her hands, feeling something she couldn't name move through her chest like a current. The woman stopped 3 feet away. She looked at Emerie the way Cormac had looked at her, that assessing, penetrating, fully present look, but with an additional layer in it. Something that looked almost like recognition, almost like relief. "Emerie Voss," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes." Emerie's voice stayed steady. She was proud of that. "I've been wanting to meet you." A pause. "My name is Sorka Male, and I think you met my son." Sorka Male did not explain herself in the market. She asked, not instructed, though the asking had the texture of someone accustomed to the latter, if Emerie would be willing to speak with her somewhere quieter. She mentioned a tea house 2 streets over. She mentioned that she had traveled a significant distance for this conversation. Emerie agreed, because she was curious and because something in her, that deep, instinct-trusting part of herself, said this woman was not a threat. In the tea house, over 2 cups of strong black tea, Sorka looked at her steadily and said, "You found my son injured in the forest. You brought him home. You fed him your last meal and stitched his wounds and gave him a place to sleep without asking for anything in return. Anyone would have." "No." Sorka's voice was gentle but absolute. "Most people would not have. Most people in this town would have left him there. Some of them would have made it worse." Emerie wrapped her hands around her cup and waited. "He didn't tell you who he is." Again, not a question. "He told me his name was Cormac." "That's true. That is his name." A pause. "What he didn't tell you is that he is the alpha king of the male pack, the ruling pack of the Hollow Reach." Sorka's eyes held hers without wavering. "He is the sovereign of every wolf bloodline within 300 miles of where you are sitting." The tea house was quiet. Someone scraped a chair at a table nearby. Outside, a cart rolled past on the cobblestones. Emerie took a breath. "Okay," she said slowly. Sorka tilted her head, visibly surprised. "That's all." "Okay. I grew up on the edge of that forest," Emerie said. "I've always known there was something in it. I just never had a name for it." For the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed Sorka's face. "He said you were unusual. He talked about me?" Sorka's expression shifted, subtle, complex, something moving behind her eyes. "More than I expected, yes." The story Sorka told over the next hour was one that changed everything Emerie thought she understood about that October night. Cormac had been in the forest because he'd been ambushed, not by enemies from outside, by members of his own pack. There was a faction, not large, but organized, and dangerous precisely because they knew the inner workings of the male pack's operations, that had been building opposition to Cormac's leadership for almost 3 years. Their reasons were complicated. Old grievances, power ambitions, ideological differences about how pack sovereignty should be exercised. But their method, when they'd finally made their move, had been simple and brutal. They'd lured him out of the pack territory under false pretense of a border dispute. They'd had 4 wolves waiting. They'd wounded him badly and left him in the forest, believing that without immediate pack support, he'd either die from the wounds or be too weak to defend himself against a formal challenge. What they hadn't counted on was Emerie. She had found him in the narrow window between wounded and critical. She had closed the wounds that would have become infected by morning. She had given him warmth and food when his body was burning through reserves. In terms of medical probability, a doctor who didn't know about wolf physiology would have said she'd saved his life. But a doctor who did know would have said something else entirely. Wolf physiology, Sorka explained carefully, was not human physiology. Healing worked differently. Connection worked differently. When a wolf was in mortal danger, genuine mortal danger, not merely injured, but in that specific threshold zone where the body's own systems were beginning to fail, physical care from another person left a mark. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. It was called a debt mark in the old tradition. Some packs called it a life threat. Whatever the name, the meaning was the same. Emerie's care had left an imprint on Cormac's biology at a level far deeper than wound and recovery. It doesn't create feelings, Sorka said carefully. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't manufacture emotion or compulsion. It doesn't make him beholden to you or you to him in any forced sense. She paused. What it does is, it opens a door. Between two people. A door that is usually only open between mates. Emerie stared at her. I'm human, she said. Yes. I'm completely, ordinarily human. I know. So how does that? It has happened before, Sorka said quietly. Not often. Once in my grandmother's generation. Once, supposedly, before the written records of the pack. A human whose care was given freely, without expectation, in the right conditions, at the right moment. She looked at her cup. The pack elders have different theories about what it means. Some say it's proof that the moon's design is larger than we understand. Some say it's an aberration. Some say she stopped. What do the others say? Emerie asked. Sorka met her eyes. Some say it means the human was never fully human to begin with. The silence that followed was long and strange, and full of things Emerie did not know how to process. What does Cormac say? She asked finally. Sorka's expression did something complicated. He says the question of what you are is less important than the question of what you choose. Emerie sat with that for a while. Where is he? She asked. That, Sorka said, is the problem. The faction that had ambushed Cormac had not given up. They had, in fact, escalated. When Cormac had returned to the pack, wounded but alive, which was not the outcome they planned for, they had moved quickly. They couldn't challenge him openly while he was recovering, so they had done something cleverer and considerably more dangerous. They had gone to the Elder Council. The Elder Council of the male pack was the oldest governing body in the Hollow Reach. It predated any living wolf's memory. It had the authority, under extreme circumstances, to suspend the reign of an alpha king and call for a formal period of challenge, approving, in the old tongue, during which any wolf of sufficient rank could make a claim for the throne. The faction had presented evidence. Manufactured, Sorka was certain, but carefully done. Evidence that Cormac had secretly negotiated with a rival pack to cede portions of male territory. Evidence that he had allowed a human, a specific human, to learn critical details about pack structure and location in exchange for what they were framing as a romantic entanglement. They were using Emerie. Not directly. She had done nothing wrong and they knew it. But her existence, her connection to Cormac, her knowledge that wolves existed, this was the wedge they were driving into the elder body's trust. The proving had been called 3 weeks ago. During a proving, the Alpha King was required to withdraw from direct pack involvement. He could not make military decisions, could not exercise sovereignty, could not call on pack warriors for protection. He was, in effect, isolated. And isolation, for a wolf who had just survived an ambush, in a political landscape actively hostile to him, was not a safe position. The faction knew this. Cormac knew this. And they also knew something else, something that made Emerie feel the floor tilt slightly under her, that Cormac had continued to watch over her. Not openly. Not in a way that confirmed the faction's accusations. But the wages she'd recovered, the quiet ruin of Harwick Drell, the protective presence she'd felt on her nightly walks home, that was not coincidence. That was a man exercising the only remaining form of power available to him, carefully, quietly, making sure that the human whose life had intersected with his was not left unprotected, even as his own position crumbled, even as his own enemies closed in. He's been protecting me while losing everything else, Emerie said quietly. Sorka's jaw tightened. Yes. And the faction knows about me. They know you exist. They don't know about the debt mark. That information is confined to the elder healers and myself. But they know you found him. They know you helped him. A pause. And now that I've come to see you, they likely know I'm here. Which means they'll be watching this meeting. Yes. Emerie turned her teacup slowly in her hands. What do you need from me? She asked. Sorka looked at her for a long moment. My son is proud, she said finally. Deeply, almost impossibly proud. He would not ask you to involve yourself in pack affairs. He would not ask you to take any risk on his behalf. He made me promise, when I told him I was coming here, not to ask you for anything. She paused. He said you'd already given enough. But you're here anyway. Because he's wrong, Sorka said simply. He thinks protecting people means carrying everything alone. He always has, even as a child. Something shifted in her face, a mother's grief, old and well-worn. He's facing a proving against 3 challengers, at least 2 of whom have been enhanced. There are drugs, old ones, black market pack compounds that increase aggression and temporarily boost wolf strength. If he goes into the proving circle as he is now, I believe they'll kill him. The word fell into the silence of the tea house like a stone into still water. Kill. Emerie breathed. What could I possibly do? She asked. I'm human. I don't know pack law. I don't know your elder council. I don't. You have the debt mark, Sorka said. And the debt mark, under the oldest version of pack law, older than the elder council itself, grants the bearer the right to speak before a proving circle, to stand as a witness to the alpha's character, to provide testimony that the council is obligated to hear. Testimony. The faction built their case on the claim that Cormac's judgment is compromised by his association with you, that he put pack security at risk for personal reasons. If you stand before the council and testify to the truth of what happened, you found an injured man in a forest, you helped him because that's who you are. There was no exchange of information, no romantic manipulation, no security breach. You removed the foundation of their case. And if the council doesn't believe me, Sorka's expression was honest, then it changes nothing, and you've taken a risk for nothing. But if they do, it could stop the proving, or at minimum, force a proper investigation into how the evidence was manufactured. Emerie looked at the window. Outside, snow was starting to fall again, soft and steady, covering everything. She thought about Cormac sitting against a tree, bleeding, telling her he didn't need help. She thought about him eating that bowl of soup, like someone setting down a burden. She thought about the stone in her coat pocket, smooth and warm, and carved with something that looked like a sun learning to become a spiral. I want to see him first, she said. Sorka blinked. Before I agree to anything, I want to see him. I want to hear from him directly that this is what he wants. She met Sorka's eyes steadily. I'm not going to walk into a supernatural legal proceeding on behalf of a man I spent one night with 6 months ago without at least talking to him first. Sorka stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, and for the first time, the thing in her expression that had been held carefully in reserve gave way, just slightly, to something that looked remarkably like hope. Getting into the male pack's territory during a proving was, Sorka explained, not technically against pack law. The law only restricted Cormac's movements and actions, not those of civilians, and certainly not the movements of someone bearing a debt mark. In practice, however, it was watched. Everything was watched right now. The faction had eyes at the borders. They had wolves in the forest who reported back. The delicate balance of the proving meant that any misstep, any appearance of Cormac receiving outside support, coordinating with outside parties, bending the spirit of the isolation rule, could be used against him. So they went at night. Sorka moved through the forest like she had been born in it, which she essentially had. She moved without sound. Emerie tried to keep up, and mostly managed. The cold was sharp enough to hurt, but she kept her breathing controlled and her steps deliberate. The pack compound, when they reached it, was nothing like Emerie had imagined. No howling wolves, no medieval settlement, no fire pits, and rough wooden structures. It was a complex of stone and timber buildings nestled into a natural clearing, architecturally sophisticated, with long, low structures that looked like a combination of lodge and longhouse. There were lights in several windows. There were guards at the outer perimeter, two wolves who acknowledged Sorka with something between a nod and a bow and let them pass without question. They brought her to a building at the far edge of the compound, separate from the main cluster, isolated. The room inside was simple: a bed, a table, a fire. It had the quality of functional comfort rather than luxury. Someone had made sure the person staying here had what they needed, but no more than that. A shelf of books, a glass of water on the table. Cormac was sitting at the table. He looked up when the door opened, and the moment his eyes landed on Emerie, something happened in his face that he couldn't quite suppress in time. Something that moved too fast and went too deep for a controlled expression to catch. He stood. "My mother promised not to involve you." His voice was the same, gravel and still water, but there was something different underneath it now. A tension that had nothing to do with anger. "She promised not to ask me for anything," Emerie said from the doorway. "She kept her word. She told me the situation and let me decide." He looked at his mother. Sorka raised her chin fractionally. "I'll leave you both," Sorka said simply, and withdrew, pulling the door closed behind her. Emerie walked into the room. The fire was warm. She stood on the opposite side of the table from him and looked at him properly for the first time since October. He was better than he had been. No visible wounds. The same architectural face, the same dark, deeply alert eyes. But there were lines around them that might not have been there before. The particular lines of someone who has been managing something heavy for a sustained period without adequate rest. "You've been watching over me," she said. He didn't deny it. "You were left exposed because of me. I was fine. You were fine partly because I made sure you were." "Cormac." She said his name quietly. "Why didn't you come back?" The silence that followed was different from the silences of that October night. This one had weight to it. History and complexity and things left unsaid pressing against its edges. "Because coming back would have made the situation worse for you," he said finally. "They were already going to use you as leverage. Every contact I had with you added ammunition. So you stayed away to protect me." "Yes. While spending your own political capital to quietly fix things in my life." A pause. "That's a generous interpretation. Is it the wrong one?" He didn't answer. Emerie took a breath. "Your mother says you'll die in the proving if it proceeds. She says the challengers have been enhanced. My mother worries." "Your mother is right." She looked at him steadily. "I can feel it. I can't explain how, but I can feel that she's right." Something changed in his eyes. "The debt mark. I don't really understand what that is." "It means," he stopped. Started again. "When you helped me, you left something in me. An impression, a connection. It runs both directions, though it takes time for the human side to develop awareness of it." He was looking at her very carefully. "Can you feel much?" "I feel that you're tired," she said. "And I feel that you're afraid, even though you won't say it. And I feel," she stopped. "What?" Low, almost inaudible. "I feel that you don't want me here," she said carefully. "But not because you don't want me here." The fire crackled between them. Cormac lowered himself back into the chair slowly, and for just a moment, in the firelight, he looked exactly like he had in her cabin, like someone setting down something heavy. "If you testify before the council," he said, "you will be putting yourself in the middle of a packed political conflict that has nothing to do with you. You will be visible to people who do not treat humans with the respect you deserve. You'll be known. You can't unknow that. Once the pack knows your name, your face, your connection to this situation, that follows you. I know. You don't know what that actually means." "Maybe not," she agreed. "But I know what it means to have been helped by someone and then watch them face consequences alone because they were trying to protect you." She paused. "I spent 6 months wondering if you were okay. I didn't know why. Now I do. And now that I know, I'm not going home and waiting to hear whether you survived." He was quiet for a long time. "The testimony might not be enough," he said at last. "I know that too. Even if the case against me is dismissed, there are 3 challengers who have legitimate standing to issue the proving. Dismissing the manufactured evidence doesn't eliminate them, but it changes the context. It means they're challenging you openly, on their own terms, without the cover of the council investigation. That changes how the elder body sees it." She paused. "Your mother told me quite a lot on the walk here." Something flickered in his expression. It might have been amusement, if it wasn't buried under so many other things. "She is thorough. She loves you very much." The amusement, or whatever it was, faded. He looked at the fire. "She shouldn't have come to you." "Why not?" "Because," he stopped. "Because why?" He looked at her, and this time he let her see it. The full, unguarded version of whatever lived behind those eyes. The thing he'd been keeping controlled since she walked through the door. It was complicated, and it was deep, and it was not something that had assembled itself in 6 months of distance. It looked like something that had been there since October. Since a dark forest and a bowl of soup, and not to you. "Because I don't want you involved in this for the wrong reasons," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. What you gave me was freely given. The debt mark doesn't change that. It doesn't obligate you. I need you to understand that." A pause. "If you do this, I need it to be because you choose it. Not because you feel connected to me through something you didn't ask for. Not because my mother made you feel guilty. Not because you think you have a debt." "I don't think I have a debt," she said. "I think you're a person I met in a forest when we were both at very low points. I think you ate my soup and you carved a stone and you spent 6 months making sure I was safe from a distance because that's apparently just who you are." She took a breath. "And I think if I walk away from this and something happens to you in that proving circle, I will spend the rest of my life knowing I could have done something and didn't." Cormac looked at her for a long, long moment. "You are the most stubborn human being I have ever met," he said, and his voice had changed, something in it that was rough and full in a way it hadn't been before. "I grew up on the edge of your forest," she said simply. "I had to be." Emerie stood before the elder council of the male pack at 7 in the morning, 2 days before the scheduled proving. The chamber was carved into the base of the oldest oak in the hollow reach. A tree so large its hollow could hold 20 people standing, its walls polished smooth by centuries of use. The council sat in a curved arrangement of carved chairs, 7 elders, the oldest a woman so ancient she seemed to have more in common with the tree itself than with the people around her. They were not hostile, but they were not warm. They were attentive. In the way that Cormac was attentive, that Sorka was attentive. Fully, completely present, with the quality of people who registered everything and forgot nothing. Emerie spoke for 20 minutes. She told the truth, completely and plainly. The forest path in October. The injured man at the base of the oak. Her decision to help him, motivated by nothing beyond the fact that he was hurt, and she was the only one there. The wound care. The soup. The morning when he was gone. She described the stone, which she had brought with her, and passed it around the council without being asked. She told them about the 6 months afterward. About noticing that she was being watched over. About Sorka's visit to the market. About walking into the hollow reach for the first time in her life. Past borders she'd been taught her whole life to respect, because she had made a decision about what kind of person she was going to be. When she finished, the chamber was quiet. The oldest elder, the woman who resembled the tree, spoke. "You are not afraid," she said. Her voice was thin but precise as a blade. "I am," Emerie said honestly. "But I'm here anyway." A pause. The elder looked at the stone in her palm, turned it once, handed it to the woman beside her. "Do you know what this mark is?" "Cormac's personal seal," Emerie said. "He left it for me that morning. I think it was his way of saying, I was here. Or thank you. Or I acknowledge what you did." She paused. "I kept it because it was all I had to understand why that night felt important. This mark," the elder said, "is not merely a seal. It is the male king's binding mark. It is left, in our tradition, only for a person the alpha acknowledges as under his personal protection, not as pack member, not as ally, as personal ward. She let that land. It has not been used in my lifetime. The silence in the chamber shifted, changed quality. He was protecting you, the elder continued, from the moment he left your home. Long before the faction's manipulation became relevant. Long before political calculation would have suggested it. She looked at Emerie with those ancient, bark-brown eyes. That is not the behavior of a man who compromised pack security for personal entanglement. That is the behavior of a man who was attempting to honor a debt while protecting the person who created it. The faction's representative, a wolf named Brogan Lecht, seated to one side of the chamber, shifted in his chair. This doesn't address the territorial negotiation evidence. The human's testimony about personal matters doesn't. It addresses the foundation of your claim, the eldest elder said, without looking at him. You argued that the Alpha King's judgment was compromised, that his relationship with this human clouded his sovereign responsibilities. What I see instead is that he went to extraordinary lengths to keep her separate from pack affairs, to ensure her safety without involving her, and to prevent exactly this situation from occurring. A pause. His judgment was not compromised. It was, if anything, too careful. The Brogan Lecht fell silent. The formal investigation into the manufactured evidence was opened the same morning. It took 4 days. 4 days during which Emerie stayed in the male compound, in a small guest room adjacent to Sorka's own quarters, eating pack meals and learning, in fragments and overheard conversations and direct answers to direct questions, more about the world she had lived beside her whole life, without fully understanding. She met wolves who had expected to find her strange and found her ordinary. She met wolves who had expected her to be afraid and were thrown off balance by her calm. She met the pack healer, an older man named Culver, who examined the debt mark with a professional detachment that turned into frank fascination as he worked, and who told her, afterward, that the connection was stronger than most he'd documented. Stronger because? She asked. He considered his answer carefully. The circumstances of its formation. The wound itself was significant. But more than that, the spirit of the giving. There was no calculation in what you did. No awareness of what was at stake or what it might return to you. That kind of pure intent, it reads into the bond. He paused. It is not common in any species. She asked him the question she'd been carrying since Sorka first sat across from her in the tea house. Is it possible that I'm not entirely human? Culver looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she felt the weight of the answer preparing to arrive. I can't say for certain, he said carefully. Your biology reads as human. But there are bloodlines, very old ones, that thin to near nothing over generations of human intermarriage. Bloodlines where the wolf nature went dormant completely. Not absent. Dormant. He paused again. Your grandmother. She lived on the edge of this forest her whole life? Emerie blinked. Yes. And her grandmother before her? As far back as anyone can trace. Culver nodded slowly. I have no evidence. I want to be clear about that. But I have a theory. He looked at her steadily. I think the forest chose your family for a reason. I think it has been waiting for something. For exactly the right set of circumstances. For someone with just enough to bridge the two worlds. Emerie sat with that for a long time after he left. On the 4th day, the council announced its findings. The territorial negotiation evidence had been fabricated. The forged documents had been created by a pack archivist who was part of the faction, using records from a legitimate boundary negotiation from 18 months ago that had been deliberately misrepresented. 2 more members of the faction's inner circle were implicated in the ambush in October. Brogan Lecht and 4 others were formally stripped of their rank designations pending a full tribunal. The proving was not cancelled. 2 of the original 3 challengers maintained their legitimate standing, and pack law allowed for challenges made in good faith regardless of the political context around them. But the council's public statement made clear that the manufactured evidence had been disavowed, that the Alpha King's conduct had been reviewed and found consistent with sovereign responsibility, and that anyone who entered the proving circle having been proven to use illegal enhancement compounds would be permanently barred from pack standing. The compounds disappeared overnight, and Cormac walked into the proving circle 2 mornings later, against 2 challengers rather than 3, without the weight of a council investigation on his back. Emerie wasn't allowed in the circle. She stood at the edge of the gathered pack, between Sorka on her left and Culver on her right, and she watched. She wouldn't describe it afterward in detail. Not because she couldn't, but because some things belong to their moment and lose something essential when translated into words. What she would say, when asked, was this: he was extraordinary. Not merely physically. Though the physical aspect was undeniable, the speed and precision and absolute economy of movement that characterized everything she'd seen him do applied here in a more complete way than she had words for. But the extraordinary thing was deeper than the physical. It was the quality of his presence. The way he occupied the circle, like the circle had been made for him, and he had never doubted it. It took 40 minutes. When the second challenger yielded, the sound that came from the gathered pack was not a cheer. It was something older and more resonant. A sound from the base of the chest rather than the throat. Cormac stood in the center of the circle, breathing hard, a cut on his temple and another on his forearm, and looked out at his pack. And then he looked at Emerie. From across the distance, through a crowd of wolves who were not her kind, in a forest she had grown up beside but never belonged to, he looked at her, and it was like being found after a very long time of being lost without knowing you were lost. The aftermath of the proving was quiet and strange and slower than she expected. The pack dispersed back into its rhythms. The tribunal process for Brogan Leck's faction began its formal proceedings. The compound returned to something like ordinary function. Cormac had his wound attended to by Culver, and then disappeared into a series of meetings with his senior counsel that lasted through the rest of that day and into the evening. Sorka found Emerie in the guest room as the sun went down, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the stone in her palm. "He wants to see you," Sorka said, "when the meetings are done. Tonight, if you're willing to wait." "I'll wait," Emerie said. She waited. He found her in the long gallery off the main hall, sometime near midnight. The gallery had windows that looked out into the forest, and the moon was full and white and enormous, laying a pale stripe across the stone floor. He stopped in the doorway. She turned around. They looked at each other across the moonlit room. "You should be resting," she said. "So should you." He walked toward her. He moved the same way he always moved, deliberate, unhurried, like he had made a decision about direction and saw no reason to rush toward it. "Are you all right? I should be asking you that." "I'm fine." He stopped in front of her, close, though not quite close enough to touch. "Emerie, Cormac, I need to say something, and I need to say it properly, which means I need you not to deflect." She crossed her arms. "I deflect. Constantly." A pause. "You redirect. You ask questions. You turn things back." Something in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. "It's one of about 40 things I've noticed about you. You've been watching me for 6 months." "Yes." Simple. Unapologetic. "I have." She uncrossed her arms. He looked at her in the moonlight, and she thought about Culver's theory, dormant bloodlines, thin ancient threads, a forest that chose a family and waited for exactly the right moment. She thought about what it meant that this felt so much less strange than it should. Standing in the hall of the Alpha King of a wolf pack in the forest she'd grown up beside, in the middle of the night, with the moon full and her heart doing something steady and significant in her chest. "I don't have a clean way to say this," Cormac said. "I'm not. This is not something I'm practiced at." A pause. "The debt mark complicates everything. I know that. The connection it creates. I need you to know that it doesn't drive what I feel." The mark opened a door. What I felt walking through it was mine. "What do you feel?" she asked quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Like I've been waiting for you. Which makes no sense, because I didn't know you existed 6 months ago. But that's what it feels like. Like all of this, the ambush, the forest, the path that led me to that specific tree at that specific hour, was necessary. Like the shape of my life up to that point was leading to a bowl of soup in a falling apart cabin." Emerie felt something shift in her chest, deep and tectonic. "I grew up on the edge of your forest," she said softly. "I could have walked that path at any point in my 28 years and found you. Or not found you. Or found something else entirely." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what Culver told me. About dormant bloodlines. About the forest choosing my family." A pause. "I don't know what I am. But I know that whoever I am, whatever mix of things made me, I was made in the shadow of your territory. I was made by the same woods that made you." His hand came up slowly and turned upward between them, not a gesture of taking, but of offering. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, careful and certain. Outside the long gallery windows, the forest breathed. The moon laid its white light across everything. And in the hall of the male pack's sovereign house, in the silence between one thing ending and another beginning, they stood together and let what was real simply be real. It did not resolve into simplicity. Things that matter rarely do. Emerie did not move into the compound the next morning. She went home. To her cabin, her plastic-sheeted window, her job at the laundry service and the miller's supply room. She went home because she had a life, and that life mattered, and the answer to being found was not to immediately dissolve into someone else's world. Cormac did not ask her to stay. He understood this without needing it explained. She was learning, a man who understood most things without needing them explained, which was either deeply comfortable or quietly unnerving, depending on the moment. He came to her, instead. Not every day, not in a way that disrupted or crowded, but he came. Sometimes in the evening, walking the forest path between the compound and her cabin with the ease of someone moving through his own living room, arriving at her door with no ceremony and no announcement, and sitting across from her at the small table where she'd once given him her last bowl of soup. They talked. About everything. About the pack and its politics and the history she had lived beside without knowing. About her grandmother's life on the forest's edge and the things the old woman had told her in whispers that Emerie had half dismissed as folklore. About the dormant bloodline theory, which Culver was pursuing with what the old healer described as professional interest and what Cormac described as obsessive enthusiasm. About what the future might look like when built between two worlds that had never officially acknowledged each other. That last conversation happened on a night in late January, when the snow was deep and the fire was high, and the world outside was the particular blue-white silence of a full winter. "The pack will have opinions," Cormac said. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking into the fire. "Many of them positive. Some of them not. I know. It will take time. I know that too. And you," he paused. "You will have to decide what you want. Not what you feel, not what the debt mark pulls you toward. What you, Emerie Voss of the cabin on the edge of the forest, actually want your life to look like." She looked at him from across the fire. "I want to understand what I am," she said. "I want to know if Culver's theory is right, and what it means if it is. I want to keep my jobs, at least for now, because they're mine and I earned them." She paused. "I want to know who my grandmother really was." Another pause. "And I want you to keep coming to this table." Cormac looked up at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of very little," she said honestly. "But I'm sure of the things that matter." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the table between them. A second stone, darker than the first one, larger. The same circular mark carved into it, but fuller. Not just the inward spiral, but the full design, the spiral, and the outer ring that enclosed it. She looked at it. What does the outer ring mean? The first mark means personal protection. My ward. A pause. The second mark means the circle is complete. It means I claim what is inside it. Not as possessive, as committed. He met her eyes. It's the mark I was made for. I've never used it before. Emerie reached across the table and picked up the stone. It was warm. Warmer than it should have been. Warmer than the first one had been on a cold October morning. She closed her hand around it. Okay, she said softly. He exhaled, and it sounded like something that had been held for a very long time finally letting go. Spring came to the hollow reach the way it always came. Not gently, but decisively. One morning the ice broke and the forest shook itself awake, and everything that had been waiting quietly under the white came back to the surface. Culver's findings, when they came, were careful and qualified and more certain than he would have liked. He was the sort of man who preferred uncertainty to commitment, professionally speaking. The dormant bloodline was real. 3 generations of near dormancy. A great-great-grandmother who had left the pack on the western border after a conflict that the oldest records described only obliquely. A human marriage. Children who were biologically wolf but had never shifted, the shift capacity thinning with each generation until it became something more like potential than ability. And then Emerie, who was, Culver confirmed, the first in 4 generations to have a dormant capacity strong enough that specific circumstances could, theoretically, activate it. Theoretically, no one pushed it. There was no test, no ceremony, no artificial catalyst. Culver said it was possible that the capacity would remain dormant her entire life, and that this was neither a failure nor a loss. He said it was equally possible that it would activate on its own, in its own time, in circumstances no one could predict or engineer. He said that some wolves waited their entire lives for their shift and never experienced it, and lived full and complete lives within their packs regardless. He said that the question of what someone was mattered infinitely less than the question of what they chose to do with it. Emerie thought about that a great deal. She told Cormac everything Culver had found, sitting at her table on a spring evening, with the cabin windows open for the first time in months and the smell of the forest coming in on the warm air. He listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening. She had noticed that early, and it still struck her, the quality of his attention. Not passive, active and complete. When she finished, he said, "Does it change anything for you?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. "It explains some things," she said finally. "Why I was never afraid of the forest. Why I always felt like the cabin was exactly right, exactly where I was supposed to be. This specific spot, this specific edge. Why my grandmother talked about the trees like they were people she knew. Does it explain you?" he asked quietly. She looked at him. "I think I was already explained. I think I've always known who I am. This just fills in a history I didn't have." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You were extraordinary before you knew any of this," he said. "A woman who gives a stranger her last meal in the middle of a hard winter. Who stitches wounds with steady hands and asks for nothing. Who walks into a room full of wolves and testifies for a man she met once, in the dark, because it was the right thing to do." His thumb traced across her knuckles. "The bloodline doesn't make you what you are. You did that yourself." She turned her hand over and held his. "We should go for a walk," she said. "In the forest." He looked out the window at the spring evening. Now. So they went. Into the hollow reach. As the last light slid between the trees and the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. Emerie walked into the forest she had grown up beside her whole life, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a boundary. It felt like coming home. The trees closed around them, familiar and vast. The air smelled like earth and water and something ancient that didn't have a name. She didn't shift that night, but somewhere deep in her, something that had been waiting for a very long time, longer than she had been alive, longer than she could account for, stirred, very slightly, and opened one eye. "Not yet," it seemed to say, "but soon. There is something I want you to take from this story. Not the wolves. Not the politics or the mark or the ancient oak chamber where 7 elders sat in carved chairs and changed the direction of everything. Not even the love story, though I hope you felt it. The way it built slowly, honestly, from a bowl of soup and a smooth dark stone, and the specific quality of a man who says not to you and means it every time. What I want you to take is this. Emerie had nothing. A leaking cabin, an empty pantry, 6 weeks of rejection letters and 2 part-time jobs, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together with your bare hands for so long that the holding becomes its own weight. And when the most alone version of herself crossed paths with a stranger bleeding under a tree, she didn't calculate. She didn't consider what she had to lose, because she knew she had very little. She didn't wait for someone more capable to come along. She just helped, because that was who she was. Not because she knew it would come back to her. Not because she sensed destiny. Not because something in her recognized what he was. Because she was the kind of person who helps. And that turned out to be the most powerful thing she possessed. Not the dormant bloodline. Not the debt mark. Not any supernatural inheritance or ancient connection. Just the choice, made on a cold October night in the dark, to give what little she had to someone who needed it. What you give in your lowest moment will outlast everything else. That is not a convenient story. It is a real one. Emerie Voss gave her last meal to a stranger, and it became the first act of the rest of her life. If this story reached something in you, if you felt even one moment of it is real, then you already understand why we do this. We tell these stories because they carry things that plain words can't always hold. Truth wrapped in wolves and moonlight and ancient forests. Love that builds without rushing. Strength that looks like soup and stitching thread. This channel exists for every person who grew up on the edge of someone else's world, feeling just outside it, wondering if they belonged anywhere at all. If that's who you do, you belong here. Hit the subscribe button right now. Not because of an algorithm, because you deserve to have a place where the stories take you seriously, where the endings are earned, where the love is real and the strength comes from inside, and the people who give the most are never forgotten. Every single week, we bring you another story, another world, another truth in a different shape. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and when the next story drops, come back. We'll be here, and so will you.